If you're going through hard times and looking for a way out, it's important to remember that life isn't an Olympic figure skating event. There are no added points for difficulty. You either stay stuck or escape. That's why you deserve to take the path of least resistance. And any voices telling you that's not allowed are not voices invested in your freedom. My name is John Oakes, and this is the Easy Way Out. So today we're going to be talking all about emotional eating. It's been coming up a lot lately. I've been doing a lot of, free consults with potential one-on-one clients. Also, I just traveled to the Midwest, so I had plenty of opportunities to consume large amounts of food and watch other people do the same. That's big in the Midwest, if you didn't know that. Cheese curds, fried things on a stick, good stuff like that. Anyways, yeah, if I didn't mention it, I went to a wedding, and that was good. Traveling was crazy, as you'd expect right about now. Getting out there was no big deal, but getting back took some doing. Ended up getting back home at like 1:30 in the morning with 2 little kids. Not super fun, but it could have been worse. So today, one new thing I'm doing is I am recording live on TikTok. Well, I'm not recording on TikTok, but I'm doing a TikTok live as I record the podcast, warts and all. Awkward pauses that I will edit out later. So if that's something you want to be able to watch live in the future, let me know and I can get some kind of list together to notify people when I'm going to do the live podcast. So what is emotional eating? Well, first off, it's something that affects a lot of people. And if it's something that affects you, I just have to say you're not alone. There's nothing inherently shameful about it. Shame is a key feature of emotional eating, and I'm going to explain in some detail why that is and why shame isn't a response to how bad you feel about the emotional eating. It comes off that way, but mechanistically, it doesn't really work that way. It serves a much larger function. I guess I'll start with this idea that emotional eating isn't really emotional eating. It's actually the opposite. It's what we do when we are uncomfortable with our emotions and unwilling to feel them, which is a key part of how we process our emotions and store them and other memories that they're attached to in our long-term storage in our frontal cortex. And when we don't do that, they end up getting bounced around to various parts of our neurology, including into various parts of our body. Anybody who's read Body Keeps the Score or is informed about somatic pain, PTSD, things like that, knows what I'm talking about. But we won't get too far into that today. So emotional eating isn't emotional. Gee, how could that be? Well, let's take Sally, for example. And Sally is an emotional eater. She felt stressed at work, and so she comes home and she does bad things to bags of chips. Now, this seems like, well, she had an emotion, and so she ate. But actually, what's happening is Sally is feeling stress or a feeling that is causing stress. And her reaction is to feel uncomfortable at that feeling, unwilling to fully feel it. And now she has a great discomfort that she now has to mitigate. Now, Sally's way of mitigating this discomfort is to eat a lot of food. And if we break this down into its constituent parts, we can see that not much here is what it looks to be on the surface. Not much here is what we think it is at face value. So I guess I'll elaborate on the idea that emotional eating is not emotional. Or if emotional eating is emotional, it's really a response to one emotion, and that is discomfort. So if we can build comfort with our emotions, we can end emotional eating. Easier said than done, but that is the main idea behind letting go of any compulsive behavior, definitely including eating. Maybe I'll back up and just note that one of the reasons emotional eating is so pernicious and so widespread is that it often begins in childhood when a child is not being cared for properly, is experiencing neglect, abuse, or just experiences some of the curveballs life can throw at you, like the loss of a parent, loss of a beloved grandparent, family dog, what we could call adverse childhood experiences. And if you remember being a kid, there's a lot more emotions than ability to process or understand those emotions or be able to put context around your own emotions. That's what we develop later in life in adulthood. So you either ask a parent to help you process your emotions or you turn elsewhere to find comfort. And most kids don't have access to black tar heroin or cigarettes, but they do have a fridge. Every kid has a fridge. Every kid has something that they can sneak and sort of get that little hit of sugar or whatever it is that does give them initially a sort of a chemical feeling in their body. Like we all know how kids can just really get absolutely lit on sugar. And even though today, when you're 35, 55 years old, you eat that donut and you don't get the same sugar rush, you're still trying to engage with a memory that for you is very much alive. And it's weird how, not weird, it's interesting how the memories connected to our survival mechanisms kind of mirror how memories connected to our triggers can pop up and sort of take the wheel and send us into a bit of a tailspin, really taking control away from us and sending it into this like override system that is fight or flight. Emotional eating definitely has there's a time travel effect. And this is again something that anybody who's dealt with PTSD or severe panic or emotional triggers know something about. And you may have been experiencing it all your life and no one's really ever explained it to you. Food is also interesting because, just a quick tangent, because smell is one of the senses most tied to memory. Smell is also one of the key features of taste, right? You hear different statistics about what percentage of our taste is actually smell, but taste does play a huge part in memory as well via smell. So when we're sort of experiencing memory alongside visceral sensations in the present, this can be a powerful concoction. Does it actually make us experience what we're trying to experience, that comfort, that sense of freedom, or maybe a bit of identity creation? I am different from my parents because I am doing something naughty that I'm not supposed to do, right? That's the inherent reason for rebelliousness and misbehaving, because the little mind has to differentiate itself from the parents in order to progress through the chain of human and child development. So we know that eating is tied to memory in a number of ways, but we have to talk about the idea of flashbacks. How can a memory be evoked but somehow be different than other memories? Like I can have a memory of, oh, I remember being on a road trip and driving over the bridge at Vantage over the Columbia River. And I can remember that because I'm reminded of the Columbia River. Maybe somebody mentioned seeing Dave Matthews at the Gorge. Or I can be on a trip today, crossing that same bridge and remembering crossing it many times as a kid, and holding your breath across the bridge, and just the things we get nostalgic for. But when memory tickles certain parts of your brain, particularly the parts of your brain that are there to sense danger, perceive danger, and then avoid it, sometimes those parts of your brain get confused and they can see a memory as something that's happening in real time. Now, one of the ways this gets evoked is by feeling a feeling that is too similar to what we felt while we were being traumatized, or as a result of the trauma, the original sin, or the original event when we were a kid. So if you felt sad as a kid during this time, possibly as a result of not being able to process what you were experiencing. I mean, after all, trauma isn't so much an event as a failure to process the event, an inability. It's when the amount of information coming at a 7-year-old or a 10-year-old exceeds their cognitive development and their ability to process fully what they're seeing in a way that makes them feel still a part of a worldview that makes sense to them. So when a child feels that their life is threatened, any associated emotion can be tagged with something far more heavy than a normal emotion. I don't feel like I'm doing a very good job of explaining this, but hopefully you get the the basic idea. People are pretty familiar with triggers, but if you've never heard about this stuff before, there you go. So one of the key features of a trigger is that when you experience this trigger, you're no longer experiencing a memory like, oh, I remember that time that I crossed the bridge. You are crossing the bridge. It's happening for your brain in real time. So while, yes, Sally was stressed at work because her boss yelled at her and gave her too much work, gave her, Linda's work, and put too much on her plate, on Sally's plate, and just expected her to just somehow just do it. Just do it, right? Quit complaining. It doesn't matter if it's not fair. Just do it. And Sally's stressed out because, anybody would be stressed out by this, right? We could have Dave. Maybe Dave had the same boss do the same thing to him, but Dave didn't have a dad who did that also. So it's just, man, my boss sucks. And Dave goes home and it's not that big of a deal for Dave. But for Sally, this is far bigger than just having a boss who's being a jerk. It evokes the powerlessness she felt at key points in her childhood. And she sees her illogical, over the top, overreacting response to these things. On the one hand, she's powerless to stop them. On the other hand, when she's watching them, she's like, how can I be this out of control over something that I know isn't that big of a deal? Because Sally might not realize that what she's experiencing isn't the same experience that Dave is having. Could be the same boss doing the exact same things to you, but if your brain is full of these unprocessed emotions and memories, you can experience the present day in very different ways than people who are, carrying around a lighter load. So when Sally comes home, she's not just dealing with the stress of her boss being unfair to her and being mean to her and being critical. This experience has evoked the powerlessness of being chastised and having a parent put too many expectations on you that you couldn't meet, even though you were trying your very best. This instilled in Sally the idea that no matter how hard she tried, she would never be good enough. No matter how hard she tried to be loved by her dad and seen as okay, it was never good enough. And that the way we get love is inherently unfair. So now in Sally's life, this manifests in many ways. She pursues friends and social relationships and romantic relationships, almost setting them up so that people are expecting unfair things of her, because mitigating that is where she feels most comfortable. Comfort is not ideal. Comfort is just what you're used to. Comfort is the status quo. And the survival mind always says, I will take the status quo over anything new, because the status quo hasn't killed us yet. So this tripwire in Sally's mind is so sensitive to the idea that she might be mistreated the way her dad did, that she's stuck in a job where somebody's going to make her feel as powerless and worthless as she felt when she was 8. And at the same time, this very sensitive area is going to demand that it take over and run Sally's response for her. No matter how hard Sally tries to not overeat, right? If that's her survival mechanism of choice, it doesn't matter. This isn't a character issue anymore. Sally's fight or flight system has been kicked on, and this is going to override all her other normal habit patterns and executive function, the sense of self, the sense of connection to something bigger, like it could be God or something, divine. That there's a part of our brain that experiences these things, and it can get shut off when we're experiencing these triggers. And so that can also cut you off from your sense of your greater purpose or values. The logical parts of Sally's brain are literally going dark. The part of her brain that stroke victims lose, Brodmann's area 19, also goes dark. So her ability to express what she's feeling goes into the toilet, right? Her ability to journal it out or even talk it out to a friend gets greatly reduced. And this is why, we encourage people to talk through certain difficult emotions, because by processing it through the verbal centers, the time it takes for those thoughts to go through the frontal cortex, it's much, much slower than how fast things travel through the alarm bell system side of our brain. A key feature of this is that Sally is not really in the present anymore. She is in inside of her brain in so many ways in the past, experiencing it as it was happening, as it is happening. And this is why it's so hard for other people to understand why Sally does things that clearly hurt her, because they get to have a perspective and a presence to the reality that is literally what Sally is being cut off from by this overreactive, oversensitive survival mechanism, fight or flight system. And another aspect of this that I keep trying to get to is the fact that Sally's sense of time has been diminished. So the idea that you could just ride this out, like just breathe and it'll be all be okay in 5 minutes. When you're having a severe trigger like that, that kind of thinking isn't possible, or it's certainly much, much harder. But the flip side of that is that just by trying to engage that part of the brain, like some of these others, there are techniques that help us sort of turn the lights back on inside of our brains. And you could say calm down, but really to calm down this one part of our brain, we really just need to reestablish a balance and encourage activity in these other centers of the brain that are getting shut down when you're having a traumatic trigger. So with that context in mind of kind of how a childhood, or it could have been something that happened when you were 21, let's talk about how, again, emotional eating isn't really emotional. It's avoidant of our emotions in the present moment. So Sally gets yelled at by her boss. She goes home, and in this other dimension where Sally wasn't traumatized as a child in this particular way, she sits with the emotion. She's like, man, this boss is a jerk. I'm going to do something about it that's proactive and assertive, or I'm going to say, I don't really care. What this guy thinks doesn't matter about me. And I'm just going to keep doing my work. And if he has a problem with it, that's his problem, not mine. There's any number of ways to work through these things. It depends on your personality and, where you're at in life and what's most important to you at that moment. But if you're responding to, a mildly abusive boss in accordance with your deepest values and with your well-being front of mind, this is what we might call processing the event or responding in a healthy, present way. But when Sally gets home, she can't be with the feeling of, this guy did this thing to me and I didn't deserve that. I deserve much more. My well-being comes first, and I can take assertive action to redress this in whatever way is appropriate or needed. Because Sally's developmental context as a child was that those things brought severe punishment, right? Sally was punished severely if she spoke up in the face of unfair criticism. She just got it 10 times worse, right? So Sally doesn't feel like she can do anything assertive. She can do anything to really change the situation or stick up for herself or look after her well-being. She doesn't feel like any of those avenues are open to her. So the brain says, well, we now have no option but to be overwhelmed and basically put in severe danger by this emotion, this stressful feeling of the boss yelling at you that your brain is interpreting as dad yelling at you and putting you in the context of a child who's in peril rather than a 35, 45, 55-year-old person who has many decades of experience that could guide them to a different result. However, the brain is switching over into this fight or flight mode that is saying, this is the equivalent of a bus hurtling toward us, and we need to snap into action. We need to use these neural pathways that run way faster than anything through the frontal cortex, where we would, process things in our verbal centers, faster than the speed of our normal thoughts. The override kicks in and is saying, eat, 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 eat. So in Sally's mind, she has two options. Well, she has one option. She can be overwhelmed and feel powerless, which feels like dying to her, or she can try to find some other way of mitigating this discomfort this fear that the emotions around what happened with her boss are actually something that could overwhelm her like a tidal wave of doom. And the over the top flowery language is just to kind of convey the truth of how these things feel in the moment. So here's where the brain starts to get into, you could call it MacGyver mode, where except it's not really MacGyvering anything, it's just usually making things worse by making logical leaps in how it designs our sort of escape routes out of these life or death situations, quote unquote. If you've ever seen dogs fighting over food, you notice that whichever dog wins the bone won't just sit there and start gnawing on it and enjoy it, because that would leave them vulnerable to the other dog who was just fighting them. A dog will run away and try to hide before it can enjoy the spoils of victory. For almost every animal, eating is a vulnerable act. You're putting your head down, you're savoring what you're eating, you're, even if you're human and you're cooking your food, that takes your attention. You're not scanning the perimeter, looking for saber-toothed tigers. So because we have to find comfort, a place of comfort or a situation of comfort in order to eat, as the brain is scrambling for some way to reverse engineer comfort, it co-opts this sort of duct tape together solution that has invalid logic at its heart, that, well, if I need to create comfort around this discomfort I feel, that is, as we now know, a delusional misrepresentation of what reality is dishing out, I can create comfort in response to that by eating food. And it's sort of like saying all hats are red, therefore all things that are red are hats. It is a very logically invalid conclusion or invalid statement. But in a context where there's literally no other option except for experiencing something akin to death, our brain goes, good enough. And we can tell ourselves a story that this is comfort. We can tell ourselves a story that's replaying the way we felt when we first snuck that bag of candy off the top of the fridge and ate it all in a closet, as a way of expressing our individuality versus our parents, or a way of rewarding ourselves for who knows what. And so we're not actually experiencing what that food tastes like now a lot of the time, which is why, most people who binge eat or regularly eat things that don't align with their health and fitness goals will tell you that you're always chasing this high, and like maybe once out of 10 times you'll have it. You'll have that experience where it's like, oh my gosh, this food is amazing. But the other times it's some version of, it's just not good enough. And that leads people to keep eating more and more, even though they're not hungry. In fact, they're getting engorged with food, but they're still looking for that hit, that feeling that they're trying to feel. So emotional eating is, I'm not going to process my emotions because I'm deathly afraid to, and I don't know how. I don't have the capability, especially when they're triggering the alarm system. We can see how we end up chasing this feeling of the way we felt when we were 6 or 7, which keeps us tied emotionally to the events of that time in our lives. If we started eating as a response to adverse childhood experiences, when we eat in response to our brains projecting those childhood experiences onto our current circumstances, we deepen the ability to be re-triggered the next time. Does that make sense? So one of the best ways to not emotionally eat is to not allow yourself to be triggered. And one of the best ways to not allow yourself to be triggered as often is to not emotionally eat. Problem solved, right? It's a chicken and egg thing. No, I mean, this is how these vicious cycles work, because the inverse is true as well. You start emotionally eating, going to get triggered more often, which means you're going to emotionally eat more often, and on and on and on. This is how this stuff gets to be so out of control, even in people who are extremely strong, extremely competent, extremely balanced in many other aspects of life. So how can Sally begin to see what's happening and take a different path? Well, first off, she has to start seeing it, plain and simply. Most people who suffer from emotional eating do not pay attention to the emotional eating. One key feature of the act of eating things you don't want to eat at quantities that you know are bad for you is that we have to turn off the part of our brain that is able to see our behavior. We think that this is part of the shame response. And really, I think that this is a key part of the survival mechanism. Because if you're able to actually sit with your compulsive behavior, you will start to see more and more the places where it's being held together by tattered pieces of duct tape, not by a real relationship between you and the truth of who you are or the truth of how the world works. For instance, you're not actually a piece of shit, right? And if you actually sit with your compulsive behaviors and watch them, you will start to see maybe not that full big realization right away, but you'll start to see the little brick by brick, getting taken apart, the scaffolding of this delusional way of relating to the present reality can be disassembled one little bit at a time, mainly by using the invalid logic of compulsion against it, right? Because invalid logic is at the heart. I've already mentioned how the survivor's bias helps our survival mechanism say, oh my God, you're going to die if you don't eat Doritos. And then you eat Doritos and it's like, see, you didn't die. So I'm right. And that's why the survival mechanism has a 100% success rate. And that's why it can almost logically force you into believing that when it rings the bell, it really is life or death, because the survival mechanism is never wrong. And it's all based on this survivor's bias, which is, one of the most common logical biases that you can run into, whether you're trying to, suss out a logical fallacy in someone's argument, or whether you're doing, quantitative or qualitative research, stuff like that. What I would recommend that Sally do is next time she feels stressed out and she comes home and she starts to sense like, hey, I'm heading for a binge. One of the most common questions I get asked regarding emotional eating is, how do I stop in the middle of a binge? And that's sort of like saying, how do I stop falling through the ice? It's like, well, let's not get out on very thin ice to begin with, because at that point, the laws of nature are just taking over. And we could spend a lot of time and energy trying to figure out how to dig ourselves out of the ice, or we could just learn how to avoid that. Luckily, when we go on a binge, we're not usually killing ourselves. We're just setting back our emotional state or our physical condition. So we get a redo. We get nearly unlimited redos. And because of this, there's really no harm in watching your compulsive behavior. If Sally's catching this binge at 10 when it's already full bore, she's not going to be able to stop it. If she catches it at 9 or 8, she might even catch it 5 minutes before it's about to happen. But at that point, there's so much inertia behind the thought patterns that are driving her behavior at that point, that she doesn't have the cognitive ability really to shut it down. In my mind, it's, 7 is that cutoff point where maybe 7 and under, you might have a chance at steering, into the ditch versus running headlong into the brick wall. But what she can start to do is 2 things. One, start to notice when the binge is coming on a little bit earlier and a little bit earlier. And this allows her to enact whatever tools she wants to use. We can talk about some of those to head things off before they become inevitable. The other thing is that when she does end up experiencing a binge, that instead of allowing her brain to blind her from it, which is what shame is trying to do, to sit there and watch. Because why shouldn't she be able to watch? It's her behavior. It's her mouth. It's her teeth. It's her tongue chewing and, tasting and swallowing. It's her food. She probably bought it. It's her house. It's her body. Why should she not be allowed to watch this behavior? If you think about it, it's really bizarre that we kind of get led around by this idea that, oh no, you're not allowed to watch what's about to happen. And it's like, this is so bad, you don't want to see this. It's like, well, if it's so bad, why are we doing it? So just by using, how, you don't have to think to blink your eyes. Your autonomic nervous system will take care of that for you. Same with breathing. However, if you choose to, you can override that and do it manually. You can shut off the autopilot on your breath and breathe in whatever fashion you decide to. This is true of your awareness at key times as well. Even though habitually your brain likes to turn off during these moments because it's distressing to watch yourself hurt yourself, you can choose to keep the lens open to seeing whatever you're able to see. This can start off at a very low level, and over time, you can progress in how much you're able to see yourself engaging in these behaviors. So let's say Sally is a big fan of pizza. Sally orders the pizza, she eats the pizza, she knows that this was an unhealthy behavior, and then she feels shame. And maybe because she listened to this, she knows, okay, the shame doesn't want me to watch the tape. You know how a coach loses a game and he goes back and watches the game footage? Why? See why you lost. And the same thing is true for us. We can have a loss, but still end up winning life because we're able to examine the loss, change our approach the next time, learn, and iterate. This is why there's no such thing as failure, really. There's just winning or learning. Shame is shutting down that process. It's preventing you from learning what's actually happening. It's the man behind the curtain saying, the Wizard of Oz saying, do not look at the man behind the curtain. Because if you really saw how empty and how fragile a lot of your survival mechanisms are, you would be able to take them apart. And the survival mechanism itself has a vested interest in you not doing that. Survival mechanisms are sort of like bureaucracies. I studied organizational theory, and we learned that a bureaucracy, in order to accomplish its job, it always seeks to be bigger and bigger so that it can be more and more effective at whatever job that bureaucracy was established to deal with. But obviously, as we all know, bureaucracies can tend to outgrow their efficiency or their original mandate, and this can lead to redundancies and waste. The same thing is true of our survival mechanisms. They are little bureaucracies that always want to extend more and more control. However, the original mandate of survival is, hey, if a tiger is coming for me, yes, please, by all means, override my brain and make me jump, up a tree, or I don't know where you go to get safe from a tiger. The tiger safe cage, there you go. Just solve the tiger problem. But at that point, the semi's barreling toward you. It's okay to react in fight or flight. Fight or flight is not bad per se. Bureaucracies are not bad per se. When they are operating in the right way, these things all have their place and keep us healthy and keep the wheels on. So maybe Sally just starts by kind of waking up after the binge and saying, no, I don't have to feel bad about this, because John explained that this is kind of a mechanism. It's a self-fulfilling, a self-propagating mechanism that if I understand it enough, it will fall apart because it's running on lies. I just don't have access to them and I can't see them yet. Or maybe this is like a big knot. But if I try to force it to be not a knot, well, it's just going to make it a tighter knot. However, if I delicately pick at this piece or this piece and say, hey, this looks like it could come loose. What's going on with this? Eventually, you will bit by bit by bit loosen that knot, and eventually it has to come untangled. If you're patient and if you're willing to look and pull on whatever threads look like they might come loose. In so doing, Sally can raise her awareness, and her awareness can be the antidote to this matrix, this complex of delusions and compulsive behaviors. Eventually her awareness can be to the point where she can see herself going from, I am experiencing something that sucks now, and slipping into that context of, oh, I am now a helpless child who is experiencing something that she cannot deal with. And so the more Sally can build her awareness of what's going on, bit by bit, she can notice things while they're happening. She'll start to notice the precursors, so that, hey, I notice that because I'm paying attention and being willing to see and not letting shame blind me to these processes, I'm seeing that, oh, I actually knew that the boss was going to yell at me because he's a dick and he was giving me too much work that was unfair. Like, oh man, I why would I be surprised that I end up getting yelled at? At some level, I knew that that would be the result because of all the things that I was getting inundated with. And so Sally goes, oh, I was actually in some ways creating the situation where my boss would yell at me. She's not responsible for him being a jerk, but her boss couldn't yell at her for not getting an unfair amount of work done if she had not accepted the unfair amount of work. So in Sally's brain, it's never been an option to say no to the boss. Now she can say, listen, what you're suggesting is unfair to me because that's Linda's job, not mine. I have plenty to do. And if you put this work on me, it's not going to allow me to get my work done to the standard that you want it done. And therefore, you are setting yourself up for disappointment. I'm not going to be held responsible for that. I'm not going to be blamed or abused because you don't know how to manage the workflow the way it should be managed. And if you're making it my job to manage the workflow, then maybe I should be the manager. Now, maybe Sally would get fired at that point, but I'm just saying there's a lot of situations where, even the worst bosses do stuff just out of habit and because they're not really thinking. And when you're assertive and stand up for yourself, the boss may make us think about it, or your spouse, or a friend who said something rude, or the parent who continually chirps at you for your weight or whatever it is, whatever that trigger is. There are things happening up to that trigger that lead to the trigger, that awareness will give you insight into it and let you see, oh wow, I actually have more options well before the trigger ever happens. So on the front end, we can start to prevent these triggered states to begin with. Maybe they never fully go away, but that's a topic for a different day. But once you go through this process, you'll start to see how much of the football field of your mind and your being can be occupied by you acting in accordance with your values instead of being led around by the nose of your survival mechanisms. And sure, there can be things that send you into a bit of a tizzy now and again. I mean, it still happens to me multiple times a day, but you just get better at catching it, and you get better at knowing who you are, what your values are, and what it looks like to follow those things in a spirit of freedom and a permission to try things and a permission to fail and a permission for people to be upset at you if that is happening because you're looking after your well-being, that everything's fine that comes as a result of looking after your well-being, because you know that no matter who gets pissy or what comes up in the short term, the long-term benefit of putting yourself first is not selfish. It actually makes you better, yes, for yourself, but for your family, for your friends, for your job, for your boss, for your community. And in that sense, not to put pressure on it, but every time one person is able to heal an emotional eating or an addiction, they bring the world a little bit closer to healing because they are now living out of their best self. They can be a better example, a better role model, a better guide to everyone in their environment. And that's a very cool thing. That's one of the coolest things about what I do, because every time I get to help someone through this, I'm not just affecting their life, I'm affecting the lives of potentially dozens of people around them. So we're coming up on an hour. My phone died, so I didn't get to see all the questions that people asked. Let me think through everything I've talked about and just see if I can clarify a couple of key things, because there's so many different ways to explain this, and usually I'm explaining it to someone who's experiencing emotional eating in their own unique way. So I tailor this kind of overview to what makes sense to them and the words that make sense to them. But because I'm speaking to a broad audience, I've been trying to explain it in more general terms. So to recap, the reason you eat things that your heart doesn't really care for, the reason you do things that you don't want to do, is because you're not able or willing to feel feelings that you don't want to feel. This can sound trite. I don't mean it to sound that way. It's always more complex in the moment. I'm very sympathetic to that, believe me. Noticing these things and accepting the truth of our unwillingness to sit with reality and to experience it and to experience our emotions. As maybe you've heard me say before, thoughts are subjective, feelings are objective. The idea that When you experience an emotion, that's a real thing. That's part of your reality. And denying it is just as harmful as denying that, oh, I'm about to drive into a brick wall. Well, maybe it's not just as harmful. I'm just saying it's harmful. You can ignore an emotion and do so every day for 65 years. You can only drive into brick walls so many times. So that was a bad example. So we've tried to bring some light to the underpinnings of why Sally comes home and eats after her boss yells at her. We know that it's not really about the boss. It's about memories that evoke powerless states that trigger the survival instincts. And when these instincts kick in, we aren't in control anymore. Evolution is in control. Fight or flight is in control. The desire to prize survival over everything else in the moment kicks in. When there's a part of your brain that's trying to save your life at any cost to your mind and body and well-being, short of dying, it can do enormous harm. And then when it wipes its hands of the dust and says, "Great job, survival mechanism. We'll be back next time to save you," you're left picking up the pieces, wondering, who am I? Why do I do this? And it usually feeds into and deepens the false narratives about who you are and what you believe about yourself, and maybe causes those voices that echo up from the past to grow stronger. The voices that said you weren't good enough no matter what you did, on and on and on. And next we see that in the moment, what's happening is that Sally is experiencing an emotion that she does have the bandwidth to process, because Sally isn't 8 years old anymore. She's 38, she's 48, she's 58. And 58-year-old Sally has so much experience and wisdom and space and intelligence that the 8-year-old didn't have. 58-year-old Sally, for all her issues and trip ups and idiosyncrasies, has a fully developed brain, or nearly fully developed, whereas her 8-year-old self did not. She also has 50, 40, 30 years of experience to draw on and context to lay over the situation, ways of using perspective or mindset shifts or reframing to help her 8-year-old self understand that, no, despite getting yelled at, we're actually still safe, and here's why. Obviously, you can't explain away a trigger. You can't logically line it out, but there is a part of the process where that helps. And all of these parts of 58-year-old Sally, 38-year-old Sally, whatever it is, can come together and make it possible, maybe not to erase this overnight, but to take the next baby step, to take the next little step of awareness or willingness to feel feelings that you don't even know the name for. Willingness to cry, even though you don't know why you're crying. The willingness to reach out for help when you know that you need it. The willingness to ignore the shame that says you're not allowed to eat healthy. You're not allowed to go for a walk because you're a piece of shit because of what happened when you're 8. And look at how you're constantly acting like a piece of shit. Right? It's using its own destructive forces as proof that you don't deserve a better life. It's just so backwards and unfair to you and disadvantageous. And so much of releasing emotional eating is not about becoming stronger or having greater resolve or more self-control. These things don't exist. Discipline doesn't exist. But prioritizing your well-being via your willingness to be in reality fully, be willing to experience the truth that is right now. Reality is magical. When you've been living in a world of delusion, cut off from all the opportunity and love and worth that is present in you and around you in this moment, when you kick the lights back on, as scary as it can be, the more you're willing to step around and actually see reality for what it is, you're not going to find that the world is terrible. You're actually going to find that a lot of your worst fears are completely unfounded. And in fact, you've only been, by keeping the door closed to certain rooms that you haven't wanted to set foot in, you're now able to see all the things that have been locked away, the gifts, the creativity, the purpose, the passion, the play, the energy, the innate motivation, the self-love. And when we recreate connections to all those things, reestablish them and feed them, nourish them over time, they will grow. It's not sudden, but eventually they grow. And every new level of growth that they meet, they can more strongly interact with one another and create positive feedback loops that cause you to do things that are in alignment with your values, that create good fruit in your life, and that make you more likely to see opportunities and more able to dismiss or ignore the potential barriers and flow around them. Really, with your eyes just on the spaces between the trees. Skiers tell you if you're skiing through trees, you cannot look at the trees. You have to look at the path. Because if you look at trees, you're going to hit trees. So I'm going to try to wrap it up there. If I keep trying to wrap it up in words, I'm just going to keep talking forever. This is my podcast. I can do as many episodes on this as I want. I can ramble. I can be imperfect. That's just okay. I've tried to express everything that I have expressed today in a spirit of love and compassion for you wherever you're at. I have dealt with these things. Some days I still deal with them. Know that you're not alone. Know that you're definitely not alone in any sense, but if you feel alone and you need someone to reach out to, if you want to actually see other people dealing with this stuff in real time, you can join the Facebook group, Lose Weight with John. If you'd like my help, if you want me to, carry the pack with you up the mountain and guide you, show you how to see, show you how to reestablish a kind and loving relationship with yourself that prioritizes your deepest values and your well-being at every turn, then you can email me and inquire about one-to-one coaching. It is an investment, but the rewards are limitless. If you have questions in regard to this episode, you can ask them in the Facebook group. We can create a little discussion thread, which that's actually a good idea. Maybe I'll just start a discussion thread in the Facebook anyways. So if you are listening to this episode because of that discussion thread, make sure you go back and actually leave your thoughts, tell your story, and let us know what your next step is going to be. Is it creating greater awareness? Is it learning to be more assertive in acting in accordance with your values? Anything we talked about in this episode. Please subscribe to the podcast and please leave a review. Please, please, please. We got like 3 reviews. Let's get that up to 10. I know that there are 7 people out there who can take 2 seconds and click 5 stars and leave some kind words. I'd really appreciate it. It is going to help other people find this podcast and make it a more and more accessible resource for more people who desperately need this sort of message. If you have questions that I can answer regarding this topic, or you have ideas for future episodes, you can let me know. You can email me at john@oaksweightloss.com. That's JOHN @oaks with an E, OAKES, weightloss.com. And that's also where you can email me to inquire about coaching. Thank you for listening. I hope this was helpful, and I will talk to you next time.